and the rope that held the rope hung slack against the cliff face of Hacksaw Ridge, dripping with the morning rain that had turned Okinawa's red earth into a crimson slick beneath their boots. Private First Class Jimmy Castellanos watched Desmond Doss test each knot with methodical precision, his calloused hands moving along the hemp fibers with the care of a man who understood that lives would hang from every twist and splice. "You sure about this, Doss?" Castellanos asked, his voice barely audible above the distant rumble of artillery from the Japanese positions dug into the coral caves ahead. The 77th Infantry Division had been hammering at these heights for 3 days, and each dawn brought the same grim ritual. Another assault, another retreat, another count of men who wouldn't be coming down the ridge under their own power. Doss looked up from his work, rain streaming from the rim of his helmet. His medical bag sat beside him, already packed with extra bandages and tourniquets, the leather worn smooth from constant use during their push across the Pacific. "The Lord's brought us this far, Jimmy. He'll see us through what comes next." The words should have sounded naive, spoken by a man who refused to carry a rifle into combat. Instead, they carried the quiet authority of someone who had crawled through machine gun fire to drag wounded Marines from the beaches of Leyte, who had spent sleepless nights in aid stations from Guam to the coral hell of Okinawa. Castellanos had stopped questioning Doss's convictions weeks ago, though he still couldn't understand them. Lieutenant Hayes approached through the pre-dawn gloom, his face grim beneath the camouflage netting draped over his helmet. The platoon leader moved with the careful economy of a man who had learned that sudden movements drew sniper fire, even in what passed for safe ground below the ridge. Behind him, the rest of Charlie Company huddled in shallow foxholes, checking weapons and adjusting gear with the mechanical precision of men who had done this too many times before. "Orders came down from battalion," Hayes said quietly. "We go up in 30 minutes. Same plan as yesterday, establish a foothold on the plateau and hold it long enough for engineers to blow the cave entrances." He paused, studying the rope that Doss had rigged between 2 sturdy coral formations. "You planning to use that thing?" "If we need to get wounded off the ridge, sir, the slope's too steep for stretchers, and we lost too many good men trying to carry them down under fire." Doss's voice carried no challenge, only the calm certainty that had marked his approach to every impossible situation they'd faced since landing on Okinawa's beaches 3 weeks ago. Hayes nodded slowly. The lieutenant had initially questioned having an unarmed medic in his platoon, but the mathematics of combat had worn away his objections. Doss brought men home. In a war where each day shortened the roster of familiar faces, that simple fact outweighed every regulation and protocol. The rain intensified, drumming against their helmets and turning the narrow trail up the ridge into a treacherous path of mud and loose coral. Somewhere in the grey distance, a Japanese mortar coughed its distinctive sound, followed by the whistle of shells arcing over the ridge toward the American positions below. The men instinctively hunched deeper into their foxholes, though the rounds fell harmlessly into the beach area behind them. 30 minutes, Hayes repeated, then moved on to brief the next squad. Castellanos watched Doss finish his inspection of the rope, then settle back against a fallen log to wait for the signal. The medic's hands were steady as he checked his aid bag one final time. But Castellanos caught the slight tremor when Doss pulled out a small, waterlogged Bible and held it for a moment against his chest. "You ever think about after?" Castellanos asked suddenly. "When all this is over?" Doss looked up, his eyes distant. "Every day. Going home to Dorothy, maybe raising some kids, working with my hands again." He paused, glancing toward the rope that disappeared over the cliff edge. "But first, we got to get through this ridge, got to make sure every man who can come home does come home." The words hung in the wet air between them, heavy with an implication that Castellanos didn't want to examine too closely. Because looking at Doss in that moment, rain-soaked, exhausted, but absolutely resolute, he understood that his friend had already made a choice about what he was willing to sacrifice to keep that promise. If stories like this make you imagine what you'd do under fire, tell us in the comments how you think you'd react in this situation, and stay with us for the next chapters. The assault began at 0800 hours with a barrage from the naval guns offshore, their shells screaming overhead to crash into the Japanese positions atop Hacksaw Ridge. The coral cliffs shuddered under the impact, sending cascades of stone and debris tumbling down the slope where Charlie Company crouched in their staging positions. Doss felt each explosion in his chest, the percussion waves hitting like physical blows as he gripped his medical bag and prepared to follow the first wave up the muddy trail. Lieutenant Hayes raised his arm, then dropped it forward. "Let's go." The men of Charlie Company rose from their foxholes and began the climb, boots slipping on rain-slick coral as they navigated the narrow path that switchbacked up the face of the ridge. Doss moved with the second wave, his position as medic keeping him close enough to help wounded, but far enough back to avoid the initial contact. His rifle sling hung empty across his shoulder, a compromise with regulations that satisfied no one but had become as familiar as his medical bag. The Japanese mortars opened up when they were halfway to the top, the shells falling with practiced precision into the climbing ranks of Americans. Doss heard Sergeant Morrison scream somewhere ahead, saw two men from First Squad tumble back down the slope in a tangle of equipment and limbs. Without thinking, he broke from the column and scrambled toward them, sliding down the treacherous coral face with his aid bag clutched against his chest. "Medic! Medic!" The cry echoed from multiple points along the trail, mixing with the steady crack of rifle fire as the lead elements reached the plateau and made contact with Japanese defenders. Private Garcia lay crumpled against a coral outcropping, his left leg twisted at an impossible angle and blood seeping through his dungarees. Conscious but shocky, his eyes tracked to Doss with desperate gratitude as the medic dropped beside him and began cutting away the torn fabric. "Easy, son," Doss murmured, his hands moving with practiced efficiency as he applied a field dressing and prepared a morphine syrette. "We're going to get you down from here." The wound was bad, compound fracture with significant blood loss, but survivable if they could get Garcia to the aid station quickly. Doss glanced toward the top of the ridge, where muzzle flashes winked from the coral caves and American voices shouted coordinates for supporting fire. The rope he had rigged that morning hung just 50 yards away, invisible in the smoke and chaos, but offering the fastest route down. Supporting Garcia under his good shoulder, Doss began the careful traverse across the slope. Each step required testing the coral for stability, pausing when mortars fell close enough to shower them with debris, moving again when the fire shifted to other targets. Garcia tried to help, hopping on his good leg, but the shock was setting in and his efforts became increasingly unsteady. They reached the rope as the first casualties from the plateau began arriving at the cliff edge. Doss could see Hayes directing the defensive positions above, his platoon spread thin across the narrow foothold they had managed to establish. The Japanese fire was intensifying, rifle bullets snapping overhead and mortar rounds walking steadily closer to the American positions. "Doss, thank God!" Corporal Jenkins appeared at the cliff edge, supporting Private Morrison, who clutched a blood-soaked bandage against his shoulder. "Can you get them down?" Without answering, Doss secured the rope around Garcia's chest, testing the knots one final time before beginning the hand-over-hand descent. The hemp fiber bit into his palms as he controlled the wounded man's descent, feeling every strand stretch under the combined weight. Garcia's eyes stayed locked on his until the rope went slack, and voices from below called that the casualty was secure. Morrison went down next, conscious enough to help control his descent, but weakening from blood loss. Then came a machine gunner from First Squad with shrapnel wounds in both legs, followed by a rifleman whose hands shook uncontrollably from shell shock, but who insisted he could still fight. "Doc, just need a minute." Each trip down the rope and back up again felt longer than the last. Doss's shoulders burned from the repetitive motion, his hands raw despite the gloves he wore to protect his grip, but the voices kept calling from the plateau above, and each time he reached the top, Hayes would point toward another wounded man, who needed evacuation. By noon, 7 men had gone down the rope. The hemp showed signs of wear where it rubbed against the coral edge, individual fibers beginning to fray under the constant stress. Doss tested the damaged section with increasing concern, knowing that a broken rope meant no more quick evacuations and a much higher chance that wounded men would die before they could be carried down the treacherous trail. The Japanese counterattack came without warning, voices shouting in Japanese as enemy soldiers emerged from concealed positions in the coral caves. Hayes ordered his men to fall back, but the retreat became confused in the smoke and noise. Wounded Americans who couldn't move on their own lay scattered across the plateau, calling desperately for help as their comrades withdrew toward the cliff edge. "We have to pull back," Hayes shouted over the increasing fire. "Mortars are zeroing in on our position." Doss looked across the plateau, counting voices, estimating time and distance. The rope would hold for maybe 6 more trips, possibly 7 if he was careful about the weight distribution. 12 wounded men lay between the American position and the advancing Japanese soldiers. The mathematics were brutal and simple. Some would be left behind. The order to withdraw came over the radio at 13:47 hours, crackling through static and the constant background noise of mortar fire. Lieutenant Hayes pressed the handset to his ear, his face grim as he acknowledged the battalion commander's instructions. Charlie Company had held the plateau for 5 hours, longer than any previous attempt. But Japanese reinforcements were moving through the cave system, and intelligence reported a major counterattack building for late afternoon. "All units, prepare for extraction," Hayes announced to the remaining men of his platoon. "Wounded first, then covering fire for withdrawal." Doss knelt beside Staff Sergeant Brooks, whose unconscious form lay crumpled near a shattered coral formation. The sergeant had taken shrapnel to the head when a mortar round landed 20 yards away, and while his pulse remained steady, the blood seeping through the bandage around his skull told a grim story. Moving him would be dangerous, leaving him would be fatal. "How many more, Doc?" Castellanos asked, sliding into the crater where Doss worked. The private's rifle barrel was hot from sustained firing, and brass casings scattered around his position told the story of a morning spent in constant contact with Japanese positions. 8, Doss replied without looking up from his patient. "Maybe 9 if we count Jenkins, though he says he can walk." "And the rope?" Doss had been trying not to think about the rope. His last trip up from the aid station had revealed significant fraying where the hemp rubbed against the coral edge. 3 or 4 strands had parted completely, and the remainder showed stress marks that suggested imminent failure. In optimal conditions, he might trust it with 5 more evacuations. Under combat conditions, with wounded men who couldn't control their own descent, the margin of safety had essentially vanished. "It'll hold," he said finally. "Has to." Castellano studied his friend's face, noting the exhaustion that no amount of determination could completely hide. Doss had been climbing that rope for 6 hours, his hands raw despite the gloves, his shoulders trembling with fatigue each time he hauled himself back onto the plateau. The medic's uniform was soaked with rain and blood, some his own from minor shrapnel cuts, most from the wounded men he had treated throughout the day. "Maybe we could rig a stretcher," Castellanos suggested. "Carry them down the trail." Trail's under direct fire," Hayes interrupted, dropping into their crater as Japanese bullets snapped overhead. "Lost 2 men trying that route an hour ago." The lieutenant's voice carried the flat tone of a man who had exhausted his options and was now working with brutal mathematics. "How much time do you need, Doss?" The medic glanced across the plateau, mentally calculating distances and evacuation times. Brooks would go first. Unconscious patients required more care during descent. Then Morrison, who was weakening despite the plasma they had managed to get into him. After that, the walking wounded could help control their own descent, speeding the process but putting more stress on the deteriorating rope. 30 minutes, Doss said. "Maybe 40 if we're careful. Battalion wants us off this ridge in 20. The words hung in the coral dust and smoke between them. In the distance, Japanese voices could be heard coordinating movement through the cave system, and the sporadic rifle fire was beginning to intensify as enemy soldiers maneuvered for better positions. Hayes had already lost 11 men during the assault and subsequent defense. The idea of abandoning wounded Americans to enemy fire violated every principle of unit cohesion and personal honor that held infantry formations together. But keeping the entire platoon exposed on the plateau while Doss completed his evacuations risked losing everyone. "Sir," Doss said quietly, not looking up from Brooks's bandaged head, "I can't leave them." The simple statement carried implications that all three men understood. If the platoon withdrew on schedule, Doss would remain alone on the plateau with the wounded, facing Japanese soldiers who were known to execute captured medics. If the platoon stayed to provide covering fire, they risked being overrun when the predicted counterattack materialized. Castellanos shifted position, checking his ammunition and sight picture toward the cave entrances where enemy muzzle flashes had been most frequent. "How about we give you the 30 minutes, Doc? Some of us volunteer to stay with you, provide security while you work." Hayes considered this, his tactical mind weighing costs and probabilities. 6 men with good positions could hold the plateau for maybe 30 minutes against light Japanese probes, but if enemy mortars found their range or if the counterattack came early, those volunteers would die alongside the wounded they were trying to protect. "Negative," the lieutenant said finally. "Too risky for too many men." Doss finished applying fresh bandages to Brooks and moved to check on Private Martinez, who lay semi-conscious near the cliff edge with both legs immobilized by improvised splints. The wounded man's eyes followed his movements with desperate attention, understanding that his survival depended entirely on the medic's ability to get him down that fraying rope before the platoon abandoned the ridge. In the aid station below, Dr. Patterson had been monitoring the evacuation through field glasses and radio reports. The battalion surgeon understood the tactical situation as well as anyone, but his perspective focused on the 19 wounded men who had already been lowered from the ridge throughout the day. Each had arrived with professional field dressings and careful splinting that reflected hours of work under fire. The medic above was single-handedly keeping Charlie Company's casualty rate from becoming a complete disaster. "Any word on final extraction?" Patterson asked his senior corpsman. 20 minutes and counting, sir. But they're still wounded up there." Patterson lowered his field glasses and studied the rain-soaked slope leading up to Hacksaw Ridge. In 3 decades of military medicine, he had learned to separate the possible from the merely desirable. Some wounded men would survive, others would not. Some medics accepted those limitations, others refused to acknowledge them at all. From his position on the plateau, Doss carefully tested the rope one more time, feeling the damaged fibers stretch under tension. The hemp would hold. It had to hold, because the alternative was leaving 8 men to die alone in the coral dust while he climbed to safety with the rest of the platoon. Would you follow the orders exactly, or trust what your own eyes and instincts tell you in a moment like this? Comment which path you'd take, and share this episode with someone who loves real human stories from history. At 14:10 hours, Lieutenant Hayes made the hardest decision of his military career. With Japanese mortars beginning to find their range on the plateau and radio reports indicating enemy reinforcements moving through the cave system, he ordered Charlie Company to begin immediate withdrawal from Hacksaw Ridge. All personnel, except essential volunteers, would descend the trail under covering fire, leaving behind equipment that couldn't be quickly carried and wounded men who couldn't be quickly moved. Doss never heard the order. He was 40 feet down the cliff face, controlling Staff Sergeant Brooks's descent with hands that had long since gone numb from rope burn and exhaustion. The unconscious sergeant's weight put tremendous stress on the deteriorating hemp, and Doss could feel individual strands popping as he lowered his patient hand over hand toward the aid station below. Only when Brooks was safely transferred to stretcher-bearers did he realize that the plateau above had gone strangely quiet. Hauling himself back up the rope, muscles screaming in protest, Doss emerged onto an abandoned battlefield. Charlie Company had withdrawn, taking their weapons and most of their equipment, leaving behind only the wounded who couldn't walk and a scattered collection of helmets, ammunition, and field gear. Japanese voices echoed from the coral caves, closer now, and the sharp crack of rifle bolts suggested enemy soldiers were preparing for a final sweep of the American positions. 7 wounded men lay scattered across the plateau, some conscious enough to track his movements with desperate eyes, others lost in semi-conscious delirium brought on by blood loss and shock. Private Martinez tried to prop himself up on his elbows, his splintered legs useless beneath him, and attempted a weak smile when he saw the medic approaching. "Figured you'd gone with the others, Doc," Martinez whispered. "Can't leave you boys behind," Doss replied, already checking the tourniquet on the private's left leg and preparing to move him toward the cliff edge. "We're all getting off this ridge." The rope showed dangerous signs of wear after Brooks's descent. Nearly half the strands had parted where it rubbed against the coral edge, and the remainder stretched alarmingly under even light tension. Doss estimated it might hold for 3 more evacuations, possibly 4 if the patients were lightweight, and could help control their own descent. With 7 men still waiting and no reinforcements coming, the mathematics were brutally simple. Martinez went down first, conscious enough to help despite his broken legs, gripping the rope with both hands, while Doss controlled the descent from above. The hemp held, though more strands popped audibly as the wounded man's weight stressed the damaged section. Voices from below confirmed safe arrival, and Doss immediately prepared Private Coleman for the next trip. Japanese rifle fire began probing the American positions as enemy soldiers emerged from the caves to investigate the withdrawal. Bullets snapped overhead with increasing frequency, forcing Doss to work in quick bursts between lulls in the firing. Coleman, semi-conscious from blood loss, couldn't help control his descent, putting maximum stress on the rope as Doss lowered him over the cliff edge. The hemp began failing halfway down Coleman's evacuation. Doss felt the sudden slack as strands parted, heard the sharp crack of fibers snapping under tension, and found himself supporting the wounded man's full weight with just his grip strength and whatever friction he could generate against the coral face. For 30 seconds that felt like hours. He held Coleman's life in his hands while the remaining rope strands stretched to their breaking point. Then willing hands from below caught the wounded man and called the all clear. 5 men remained on the plateau. Corporal Jenkins insisted he could walk, but his legs wouldn't support him after 6 hours of blood loss from shrapnel wounds. Private Morrison had regained consciousness, but seemed confused about where he was, and why shooting echoed from the coral caves nearby. The other 3 lay still, breathing but unresponsive, their survival dependent entirely on reaching medical care within the next few hours. Doss studied the rope, counting intact strands and estimating load capacity with the careful attention of a man whose life depended on the accuracy of his calculations. 3 evacuations, possibly 4 if everything went perfectly. 5 wounded men who would die if left behind. Jenkins proved too heavy for the damaged rope. Halfway through his descent, the remaining strands began parting with sounds like rifle shots. Doss found himself holding the corporal's full weight by main strength, his shoulders screaming in protest, while he tried to lower the wounded man slowly enough to prevent a fatal fall. When Jenkins finally reached the bottom, the rope hung in tatters, perhaps 6 intact strands from an original weave of 30. Morrison went down next, light enough that the rope held despite its condition, but the remaining hemp stretched alarmingly as Doss controlled the descent. By the time Morrison was safely transferred to the aid station below, the cliff edge showed clear evidence that the evacuation system had reached its breaking point. 3 men remained unconscious on the plateau. The rope would not hold another evacuation. From his position in the aid station below, Dr. Patterson watched through field glasses as the lone medic moved among the remaining casualties, checking pulse and respiration, adjusting bandages, preparing men for an evacuation that had become mathematically impossible. The doctor had seen enough combat medicine to understand what Doss was facing, a choice between accepting the limitations of his equipment or refusing to abandon wounded men, regardless of the personal cost. "Can we get another rope up there?" Patterson asked his senior corpsman. "Trail's under direct fire, sir, and we don't have climbing gear." Patterson lowered his field glasses, knowing that the next few minutes would determine whether Desmond Doss descended safely with the knowledge that he had saved who he could, or stayed on the plateau with the wounded and shared whatever fate the advancing Japanese soldiers intended for captured Americans. On the plateau, Doss knelt beside each unconscious man in turn, checking their condition and estimating how much time they had left without immediate medical intervention. Then he looked toward the cliff edge, where the ruined rope hung like a question mark against the coral face, and made the calculation that would haunt his dreams for the rest of his life. 3 men, no rope, Japanese soldiers advancing through the smoke. He closed his eyes and prayed for guidance, for strength, for a miracle that would let him bring everyone home. The secret that Desmond Doss never included in any official report, never shared with the reporters who later wrote about Hacksaw Ridge, never even told his wife Dorothy in their quiet conversations about the war, was this. For nearly 10 minutes on that smoke-shrouded plateau, he seriously considered leaving the last 3 wounded men behind. Private Henderson lay unconscious near the coral caves, blood seeping through bandages that covered shrapnel wounds to his chest and abdomen. His breathing was shallow, irregular, and his pulse had been weakening throughout the afternoon. Even with immediate surgical intervention, Henderson's chances of survival were marginal. Without it, he would be dead within hours. Sergeant Walsh had taken a mortar fragment to the head, leaving him comatose but stable. Unlike Henderson, Walsh might survive for days in his current condition, but he would never regain consciousness without neurosurgical care that didn't exist anywhere on Okinawa. Moving him risked turning survivable trauma into fatal injury. Lieutenant Morrison, no relation to the private evacuated earlier, had simply collapsed during the morning's fighting, his body finally surrendering to exhaustion, dehydration, and the accumulated stress of 3 weeks in combat. He was physically uninjured, but completely unresponsive, lost in the mental shutdown that medics had begun calling combat fatigue, because no one understood what else to call it. Doss knelt among these 3 men as Japanese voices grew closer, as rifle fire became more accurate, as the tactical situation deteriorated beyond any reasonable hope of survival. The rope was finished. Even if he could somehow repair it, the process would take longer than they had before enemy soldiers overran their position. The trail down the cliff face remained under direct fire, making evacuation by stretcher impossible for a single medic working alone. For 10 minutes, Doss calculated odds and weighed possibilities with the cold logic of triage medicine. 3 unconscious men who might not survive even with immediate care. 1 conscious medic who could still escape down the trail if he moved quickly and accepted the risks. The mathematical choice was obvious. He had saved 19 men that day. 19 soldiers who would return home to wives and children, who would live full lives because a conscientious objector had refused to abandon them on a coral plateau in the middle of the Pacific. Any reasonable accounting of courage and sacrifice would conclude that Doss had already done enough, had already exceeded any obligation to his fellow soldiers. But as he knelt in the coral dust with his hand on Henderson's weakening pulse, Doss discovered that mathematics could not resolve the central contradiction of his faith. The same convictions that prevented him from carrying a rifle also prevented him from abandoning wounded men, regardless of the tactical situation or personal cost. He could no more leave them to die alone than he could take a life with his own hands. The solution, when it came to him, was so simple that he wondered why he hadn't thought of it immediately. Without a rope, He couldn't lower the wounded men down the cliff face. But the cliff itself provided handholds and ledges that a careful climber could navigate, especially someone light enough to trust his weight to coral formations that might not support a full-grown soldier. Doss had grown up in the mountains of Virginia, scrambling over rock faces and steep slopes as naturally as walking. The cliff below Hacksaw Ridge was treacherous, but not impossible, especially for someone who had spent the day climbing up and down a rope until his hands had developed the kind of grip strength that came from supporting human weight for hours at a time. The first descent, with Henderson unconscious across his shoulders, nearly killed them both. Twice, coral formations crumbled under their combined weight, sending them sliding down the cliff face until Doss could arrest their fall with desperate grabs at jutting rocks. Henderson's breathing stopped entirely during one particularly long fall, and Doss had to perform mouth-to-mouth resuscitation on a narrow ledge 30 feet above the ground, while enemy bullets ricocheted off the coral around them. But they made it down. Henderson was transferred to a stretcher and rushed toward the field hospital, his pulse weak but steady, his breathing restored to something approaching normal. Dr. Patterson grabbed Doss by the shoulders as the medic prepared to climb back up the cliff face. "Son, you can't make that climb again. The coral's too unstable and you're exhausted." Doss looked up at the plateau where Walsh and Morrison waited, unconscious and helpless, as Japanese soldiers completed their sweep of the abandoned American positions. "Can't leave them, sir. They're depending on me." Patterson studied the young medic's face, noting the flat determination that had replaced normal fear and exhaustion. In 30 years of military medicine, he had learned to recognize the moment when a soldier crossed from heroism into something approaching madness. The point where duty and conscience fused into an obligation that could only be satisfied by death or completion. "Give me 20 minutes, Doss said quietly. "If I'm not back with Walsh by then, you'll know what happened." The second climb felt longer than the first, though it probably took the same 15 minutes of careful navigation between handholds and ledges. Doss's shoulders screamed in protest as he hauled himself over the cliff edge, and his hands left bloody prints on the coral where raw flesh pressed against sharp stone. But Walsh was still breathing, still stable, and the Japanese sweep had moved on toward other sectors of the ridge. Carrying Walsh down the cliff face proved easier than Henderson's evacuation. The sergeant was heavier but more solidly built, and his unconscious body settled into a more stable position across Doss's shoulders. More importantly, Doss had learned which coral formations could be trusted and which would crumble under pressure. The descent took only 12 minutes, and Walsh reached the aid station in better condition than Henderson had. Morrison was the lightest of the three, but also the most difficult to manage during the climb. Combat fatigue had left him completely limp, unable to help or hinder the evacuation, but also prone to sudden movements that threatened to throw them both off balance. Halfway down the cliff face, Morrison briefly regained consciousness and began struggling, convinced that he was being captured by enemy soldiers. Doss had to pin him against the coral face with one arm while maintaining his grip on the handholds with the other, whispering reassurance while Morrison thrashed weakly in his arms. "Easy, son. You're safe now. We're going home." When they finally reached the bottom of the cliff, Doss's legs gave out entirely. He collapsed beside Morrison's stretcher, his body finally acknowledging the accumulated exhaustion of a day spent climbing, lifting and carrying wounded men under fire. "Doctor." Patterson knelt beside him, checking for injuries, offering water and morphine for the obvious pain in his shoulders and hands. 22 men, Patterson said quietly. "You brought down 22 men who would have died on that ridge." Doss nodded, but didn't reply. He was thinking about the rope, about the 10 minutes when he had almost made a different choice, about the weight of unconscious men on his shoulders during 3 climbs that should have killed them all. The mathematics of heroism, he now understood, had nothing to do with numbers or odds or tactical situations. It had everything to do with the promises you made to yourself about who you would be when everything else was stripped away. 43 years later, Desmond Doss sat on the porch of his small house in Georgia, watching summer rain fall across the pine trees that reminded him of the mountains where he'd grown up. His hands, gnarled now with arthritis and old injuries, rested on the arms of his wheelchair as he listened to the steady drumming of water on the metal roof. The sound always took him back to Okinawa, to the endless rain that had turned Hacksaw Ridge into a slippery hell of coral and mud. The reporter from the Veterans magazine had finished her interview an hour ago, leaving behind the same questions they all asked about that day in May 1945. How many men had he really saved? Had he been afraid? What had driven him to keep going when everyone else had withdrawn? Doss had given the same careful answers he always gave, sticking to the facts that could be verified, the actions that had witnesses, the timeline that matched the official reports. He never mentioned the 10 minutes when he had almost walked away, never described the weight of unconscious men during 3 cliff-face climbs that had left his shoulders permanently damaged, never talked about the nightmares that still came sometimes when thunderstorms rolled through Georgia, bringing back the sound of mortars and the smell of wet coral and blood. Those details belonged to him alone, along with the memory of 22 faces that had trusted him completely in the moment when trust was all that stood between life and death. Some of those men had survived the war, returned home to build lives and raise families. Others had died later on Okinawa or in the invasions of Japan that never came. But for one day, on a ridge that most Americans had never heard of, Doss had been responsible for keeping them all breathing long enough to reach safety. The Medal of Honor citation read like most such documents: clinical, precise, focused on measurable actions and quantifiable results. Private First Class Desmond T. Doss distinguished himself by exceptional valor above and beyond the call of duty, while serving as a company aidman with the 1st Battalion, 307th Infantry, 77th Infantry Division near Urasoe-mura, Okinawa, Ryukyu Islands on 29 April through 21 May 1945. The citation went on to describe his actions during multiple engagements, including the evacuation of wounded men from a 400-foot-high jagged escarpment under devastating artillery and mortar fire. It mentioned his refusal to seek cover for himself while treating casualties, his improvisation of medical techniques under combat conditions, and his outstanding bravery and unflinching determination. What it didn't mention was the way his hands had shaken every time he tested that fraying rope, or the prayers he'd whispered while carrying unconscious men down a cliff face that should have killed them all. It said nothing about the crushing weight of being the only person standing between wounded soldiers and certain death, or about the calculations he'd made while Japanese voices echoed from the coral caves. The official count of men saved varied depending on which report you read. Some documents said 19, others claimed 22, a few mentioned 25 or even 30. Doss had stopped trying to correct the numbers years ago, understanding that the exact count mattered less than what it represented. The decision to stay when everyone else left, to keep trying when the equipment failed, to accept responsibility for lives, even when accepting that responsibility might cost his own. Dorothy brought him coffee as the rain began to ease, settling into the porch chair beside his wheelchair with the comfortable silence of a marriage that had lasted through decades of peace and occasional war stories. She had learned not to ask about the dreams that sometimes woke him, not to comment on the way thunderstorms made him restless and distant. Some experiences, they had both learned, could be shared only so far. "You thinking about the ridge again?" she asked finally. "Always thinking about the ridge," Doss replied. "Funny thing is, I remember the rope more than anything else. That old hemp rope we rigged over the cliff edge. Tested it 100 times that morning, worried about every strand, knew it was going to fail before the day was over, but it held. held long enough. He paused, watching the rain drip from the pine needles. Been thinking lately about what would have happened if I'd brought more rope, better equipment. Maybe could have saved them all without having to climb down that cliff face 3 times. Dorothy reached over and took his hand, careful of the arthritis that flared up in damp weather. You saved who you could save, Des. That's all anyone can do. The words were true, but they didn't address the central question that had followed him home from Okinawa and settled into his bones like shrapnel that couldn't be surgically removed. 22 men had lived because he refused to abandon them. But how many more men had died on other ridges, in other wars, because their medics hadn't been willing to make the same choice? How many ropes had broken under the weight of wounded soldiers while their comrades calculated odds and accepted limitations? Doss understood that the medal around his neck represented more than his personal actions on a single day in 1945. It symbolized a principle that went beyond individual courage or tactical success. The idea that some obligations transcended mathematics, that some promises couldn't be broken regardless of the cost, that faith without works was empty and works without faith were meaningless. As the rain stopped and evening light began filtering through the pine trees, Doss closed his eyes and offered the same prayer he'd whispered on Hacksaw Ridge, while testing knots and calculating weight limits. Not for personal protection or divine intervention, but for the strength to keep the promises that mattered when everything else had been stripped away. Somewhere in the distance, a rope was being tested by hands that understood the weight it would soon carry. Somewhere, a young medic was making calculations about odds and obligations while wounded voices called from the darkness. The war might change, the equipment might improve, but the essential mathematics remained constant. Some men came home, others didn't, and the difference often depended on someone's willingness to risk everything for a principle that couldn't be quantified or explained in official reports. The rope had held long enough. In the end, that was all that mattered. If this story reminded you that behind every medal there's a human being carrying memories we'll never fully see, subscribe to the channel, tell us which country you watch from, and invite someone to revisit history with us in the next story.